This video, which could conceivably be short, or medium, or long, hopefully not extreme, is going to be about range. Range in the Fantasy Flight Games Star Wars Roleplaying Game. Range is simultaneously easy and difficult. Easy because it's designed to be simple to implement in play. Difficult because it might conflict with how you've played before or how you think about range in general terms. Often in games or in life, when we're thinking about range between objects, we think in feet or meters or inches or centimeters or whatever. But in this game, we don't. They tell us such measurements are irrelevant. What is important are the relationships between things in the game. The relationship in range between two ships in a space combat, between stormtroopers and a fleeing smuggler down a gray hallway. What matters is the relationship in range bands between the objects that we care about in this particular turn of this particular scene. Range is there purely for narrative ease, rather than consulting a table about a range in, let's say, meters or hundreds of feet for a weapon. We know that it operates from a certain range band or less. Simple. That simplicity, however, relies on being able to keep things straight in your mind, keeping all spatial relationships in the game, keeping them couched in terms of range bands rather than hard and fast distances using measurements of whatever system you might use, Imperial or Rebel. So, range is broken down like this. We've got short range, medium range, long range, and extreme range. This is the character scale. This is what matters in a lot of scenes. How do characters relate to their environment? There's a subset of short, which is really a condition or a status. This is engaged. In order to engage with the target, you must first reach short range with it. And a range band does not have a set size in meters. It has a set size in terms of what can happen between two objects or two characters or two ships, and it has a size determined by how many maneuvers must be spent to traverse that distance. That's how you think about range. That's all range is. The cost of traveling from here to there, or what I'm allowed to do to a target at that range. So when considering setting the cost of traveling from one place to another place, or opening or closing the range between two things, we need to recognize that the range bands get progressively larger as we open up, or progressively smaller as we go in. So the cost between traveling from short range to medium range is a single move maneuver. The cost to move from medium into long range is 2 maneuvers. The cost to further extend the range out to extreme is 2 more maneuvers. Meters do not matter. They don't need to factor into it at all. So when a game master is setting up a scene, they don't need to think that the landing bay, the landing strip, the cargo bay, the hallway, the chute, they don't need to think how long this is in terms of meters or feet or what have you. They only need to recognize that this is a distance requiring a certain number of move maneuvers to traverse, or that it prevents easy conversation between characters, or that if they're using their sidearms, no one's going to be able to hit at that range. Right? The hangar bay door is at medium range from where the ship is. That's how you think about it. So it's very, very quick. We don't need to get into a grid level awareness of distances. We're not playing on a hex map. While the game does allow for players to make a lot of interesting tactical choices, the focus is on the dramatics of these choices, on the visuals of these choices, not on the minute level of detail or the precise maneuvering of pieces on a board for a tactical simulation of the scene. This is Star Wars as seen through the mind's eye. So the choices that we are making are about enabling ourselves to interact in a specific way with a target or prevent that interaction. The choices we're making are the uses of our resources, our action resource, and our ability to use one or two maneuvers, and maybe, if we are fortunate, get an out-of-turn maneuver added to our resource. Right? The use of the destiny pool, the choice of gear, the way that we manipulate initiative, the way that we coordinate with the members of our team, the way we try and disrupt the coordination of the members of their team. These are the tactical choices, and they're related in what it enables to happen between the opposing forces and how that shapes the situation. A YouTube user using the name Fell Voice gave me an excellent question today that ties into all of this. It ties into the use of our resources in a combat scene. It talks about the relationship of range between opponents and how we can describe these things, how we can envision them so they make sense. So the question was related to the additional combat modifiers section of Chapter 6, Conflict and Combat. And specifically, it was looking at making ranged attacks while engaged, meaning you have a gun and your enemy has brought a knife to this gunfight, which we naturally at first blush interpret as being a problem for the knife user. But there's more to it than that, isn't there? If that knife user is able to engage, then the person using the ranged weapon is now at a disadvantage. Now, we don't need a special section to deal with our ranged weapon user blasting away at the guy with the melee weapons if he's at short range or medium range or long range or whatever. That's what the normal combat system handles. But what if this guy with a lightsaber or a guy with a vibro knife or vibro sword or shock gloves or whatever manages to close to engaged with a heavy blaster user or a carbine user or what have you? What will happen? How can we use the system to model this? So the way the system models it is, if you are a melee user and you have engaged with someone who has a ranged weapon only, then you're going to get a boost die to your attack. Right? They really don't have a weapon that's suitable for defending themselves against your attack, and they're trying to shoot you, and it's awkward. You get a boost die, just one boost die, that's all. It's just a little bit better than going up against someone who's focused on dealing with you unarmed or with another melee weapon. Right? The amount of threat, the amount of caution that's required from you is lowered, so you get to attack with a little bit more verve. You earn a boost die. That's all right. And for the ranged weapon user, well, the difficulty to hit this melee fighter who's right up in your face is raised. If you're using a ranged light class of weapon, your difficulty will be increased by 1 die. If you are a heavy weapon, a ranged heavy class of weapon user, your difficulty is going to be increased by 2 dice. It's a longer, bigger weapon. It's harder to hit someone who's right there. Now, that all sounds great when you read it, but the question asked by Fellvoice went something like this. I bring a knife-using NPC into engaged with a heavy weapon user. Now they're engaged. The knife fighter gets a boost die for their attack. And when the heavy weapon user tries to attack with their heavy weapon, they're going to have a difficulty raised by 2 because he's engaged with the knife fighter. But the heavy weapon user on his turn, he spends a maneuver to disengage. Now they're at short range. The knife fighter has lost their boost die for attacking, and the penalty of 2 for being too close to the knife fighter is avoided. So what's the point of this rule? For me, it's about the relationship between the two fighters and what that enables us, what it coaxes us to describe. If we don't think about the variables involved in the combat, if we don't really think about the scene, then we might end up with the player with this long weapon that requires the ranged heavy skill to use, just able to fire at targets no matter what the range, right? Even if the person might be standing inside the barrel length of that weapon in order to cut them up with their vibro knife, right? If the game doesn't suggest that engaged is practically touching, then this thought might not occur. This suggests a particular relationship in space, too close for ranged weapons to be comfortable. Now, to get into engaged range has a cost. To earn that condition, I'm engaged with this target in melee combat, it comes with a cost. It costs 1 maneuver. So if we are at short range, then there are no special or specific penalties about using ranged weapons, but the melee fighter cannot use their weapon unless they throw it. So they want to engage. They need to spend a maneuver to engage. Right? So on their turn, he lunges in, getting inside the range, taking the initiative, spends a maneuver to engage, spends an action to attack, gets a boost die, right? Because he's inside the firing arc of the weapon. Now, the ranged weapon user has a choice. What do? Do they stay there and mix it up unarmed? Do they use their weapon as an improvised weapon now as a club? And there's tables for that in this section as well. Do they try and separate the distance? If they want to separate, if they want to disengage, it comes with a movement cost. In the same way that the knife fighter is motivated to close the range in order to attack more effectively, the ranged weapon user is motivated to separate that distance. Or as the melee fighter is trying to get into short range, they are motivated to try and keep that range open. When, where, how are they going to use their resource of movement? Maybe the ranged weapon user wanted to take cover. Maybe they need to be in a specific position. Maybe they want to adopt a guarded stance. Maybe they need to communicate. Maybe they need to interact in some way with something that is there, some panel on the wall, opening a door, keeping a door closed, that kind of thing. And the interference of this knife fighter is causing them to be displaced in space if they want to be an effective user of their weapon, if they don't want to give up that huge advantage. Right? Now, hopefully, they can cut down the melee fighter before he ever gets within engaged range. But if they are surprised, attacked from behind, someone drops out of the ceiling, whatever, if the opponent is able to get into engaged, they have significant benefit of being there. It's much harder for their opponent to hit them with their ranged weapon, and they get a bonus to attack themselves. Yay! This is a terrible situation for the ranged fighter to be in, which pushes them to move, pushes them to use their maneuver resource to deal with the situation and cancel it out, forces them to disengage. And this turns into a game of brinkmanship. I can now, as the knife fighter, I can keep engaging with you and getting that boost die added to my attack every time. And when I'm that close, I get the penalty added to your attack to shoot me, which means you have to disengage, which does nothing to prevent my ability to attack you. Now, it means that you're going to be able to shoot at me with your normal difficulty. Well, that was the risk I accepted when I got into this situation in the first place, attacking a guy with a gun while I only have a knife. So this specific case, using a ranged weapon against someone who has engaged with you in melee combat, this is spelled out very clearly in the rules of this is what you do. It's up to you to figure out how to use it, really, or when it might be relevant, but highlighting the nature of how range, maneuvers, and actions cause relationships and interactions in a combat scene, I feel is useful. And just as an example of applying the system, this is very useful. Not only does it maybe teach some younger or less experienced players something about the nature of combat with these, space weapons or whatnot, it is a short, punchy example that involves the application of bonus or penalty dice and the changing of difficulty. So when you are trying to figure out how the system works and how to learn how to make rulings about creating difficulty, assigning positive or negative modifiers in the form of dice to a die pool, I find this example is a really good one. So it has that going for it as well. And beyond just what do I do if a melee fighter and a ranged fighter start mixing it up in my combat scene, this applies across the spectrum of weapons, right? The concept of needing to open or close range. How do we represent that in combat? In Star Wars, well, the maneuver costs. The maneuver costs, especially when we get into the larger range bands, they also start causing a cost in strain. Right? So if we're using heavier weapons, weapons that can reach a target at long range, if we want to change the range so that their medium range weapon and my long range weapon, their medium range weapon is disadvantaged. We're at long range, right? If I want to keep that distance, I'm spending 2 maneuvers, right? They spend 2 maneuvers to close into medium. I have to spend 2 maneuvers to extend back to long. We won't be able to keep that up forever. And one of us will tire or run out of those resources in strain, at any rate, before the other. If I play my cards right, that'll be the other guy. Forcing the other character to use more of their resources. This is a pretty interesting tactical decision, and the opportunity to role play through it and describe what's happening creates more opportunities for better combats. Right? How are you using the environment? How are you reacting to the environmental conditions? How are you addressing what the character is actually being described as doing in order to achieve the effect you want? Maybe it won't actually be possible the way that the narrative is flowing. Right? Maybe what you want to do will have to be delayed. Now, as an example, we could talk about grappling. The knife fighter comes in, right? And instead of their attack being with their knife, they grapple, and they successfully narrate getting physical contact, right? Holding on to the opponent. Right? So now when you spend the maneuver to disengage, it's not really about opening the distance. The guy was in front of you with a knife in each hand, cutting you, but not keeping you in place. Now we've got a knife fighter with a knife in one hand and your tunic in his other. And when you spend your maneuver to disengage, now you're breaking that hold and stepping back a little bit. They can get in and cut you again the next time by spending their maneuver to engage. The conception of opening up distance pretty wide might not be there in the same way. But let's take a step back. I, a moment ago, used a very specific turn of phrase. I said, break the hold. Break the hold that the knife fighter caused with their successful grapple attempt. Right. Now, this is in the realm of the game master adjudicating things. Right? So instead of coming in and cutting with the knife, I have the melee fighter grapple. I'm successful, and I don't want to do damage. I just want to get a grip on the clothing of the other character. That other character has the right to spend a maneuver to disengage from me. I'm engaged, and that's fine. But I have grappled. I used my action to change the situation for my opponent. And I didn't apply damage, I applied a condition, right? Character's now grappled. So what does that mean? They need to spend their action to cancel out my action. So they have to break that hold. How do they do that? The same way that I did it, with an unarmed attack. No big deal. It could be opposed strength. They could be trying to pull away. It could be unarmed versus unarmed, right? Their fighting skill versus my fighting skill. How you adjudicate it doesn't matter. The cost does. Right? And being able to see that relationship is what can enable you to very quickly and freely narrate through these combats. So if the knife fighter wants to keep the gunfighter from just stepping back, stepping to the side, stepping around them, and always opening that range, so he's like chasing them across the floor, trying to get in close and get a series of attacks while preventing attacks, then he's going to have to do something like restrain the opponent. He's going to have to grab onto him. And of course, the gunfighter wants to break that hold. So my action to grab on, countered by your action to break the hold. And now if we're spending our actions, we're not attacking, and we're getting more and more tired. We need to use our maneuvers for other things. If I do break the hold, I want to get as far away as possible. So I want to spend 2 maneuvers, except I have to spend one of those maneuvers to disengage. And then I can only open the range to short. And then that knife fighter's right in there again. That is that kind of claustrophobic and scary thing that we want to prevent by setting up ways to keep that knife fighter way far away from us and never let him engage in the first place. And that's all caused by this simple rule: making ranged attacks when engaged. So once we start seeing these relationships at the closer ranges, then we can extrapolate them out and set up interesting situations, tactical advantage, recognizing disadvantage when we're at the longer ranges and dealing with ranged weapons versus ranged weapons, or laying traps, and on we go. So range, all about the relationships, all about how interaction can take place. Can we communicate at this range? Can we hit at this range? How draining will it be to close that range? How long can we sustain a chase trying to open and close the range between each other? That sort of thing. That's where description lies. That's where the visualization of the scene lies, and that's the recognition of the framework of the scene needs to be recognized by the game master and interacted with by the players to bring all of these elements out. So it's a whole lot of fun once you get going. Now, for people who are really tied to the concept of assigning a distinct range in yards or meters or hundreds of feet or whatever to a weapon, this really is the equivalent of that. You're not really giving that up, except instead of having these tiny differences between one type of gear and another, we're giving up some of that granularity for speed and ease. But in a very real and practical sense, there's not a lot of difference. If you have a heavy blaster that is accurate within 50 meters, or you have a heavy blaster that has a medium range, outside of 50 meters, your weapon is inaccurate and you're not going to be hitting with it. Outside of medium range, your weapon is inaccurate, you're not going to be hitting with it. They are the equivalent, and readjusting your thinking to handle that, and that it's a condition that's being applied. So these characters are at medium range, separated by medium range from each other, and these other characters are within short range of each other, and that set of characters, they're within long range of each other. It's only describing the maneuver cost and the gear choice and the intention behind the actions that they will use in order to accomplish their goal of affecting each other in some way. We don't need to focus on exactly how many feet are between character A and character B and how long it will take them to traverse that distance. We need to recognize how many maneuvers they need to spend to traverse that distance, or how much closer or farther away will they need to be in order to hit or prevent being hit, things like that. So it's about the choices, it's about the characters, it's about the thinking, it's about the tactics, it's about the relationships and the interactions. It's just not about the meters. So I guess at 20-some minutes we can't say from this channel's perspective, this video was long, certainly not extreme. I think our longest video is 1 hour and 40 minutes, the review of this game, actually. But I hope that even though it wasn't short, the range of topics has been satisfying and you found the video engaging.